안녕하세요, I'm Mackenzie. Welcome back to the final episode of Korean Adoptees Series. This episode is the story of Sun Yung, who was born in Seoul and grew up in Chicago with her adoptive family. Sun Yung walks me through her experience of connecting with the adoption agency Holt, her first trip to South Korea in 1987, a pivotal time when Korean people were protesting dictatorship and fighting for democracy, what this female adopted Korean American identity brings to her, and her decision to legally change her previous name to Sun Yung. What follows is our conversation.
I read from your article that you have your Korean documents, and I'm curious, is the documents that your parents always have, or is that the records you got when you have growing up?
Most of them they've always had. I got additional, little bit more information when I emailed my adoption agency, like maybe 2000 something. And they just told they had in their files the time that I was found and what I was wearing. And that wasn't in any of the files that my parents had had. And also when I went to Seoul, one of the times I went back to Seoul, I went to the Holt offices in Seoul, and I met with a social worker and brought a translator and everything, and they were able to just bring out the file of copies of things I already had, but then they also said, well, this is all that we can show you, that there's basically implying that there was more that they couldn't show me, but that they didn't have any information on parents or relatives. I think that it might have been like my foster family's information, maybe their name and address or something like that. That would make sense for them to keep track of, but maybe keep anonymous, but they couldn't even say what it was. So that's really all I know.
Did you find your biological parents?
Mm-mm.
No, because you didn't get the address and information.
Right. I didn't have any information, and you can do this thing where you put a letter in your file in case a relative or someone comes looking for you. Then I've given Holt information. Here you can give my, American name and my address at the time and email, and it's my phone number at the time. I haven't updated that in several years, but yeah, that's pretty much all that they can do. I didn't, I have friends and colleagues who've gone on there's been one or two TV shows, that you've heard of. Like one is called, I think it's like I'm Missing This Person. It's not just for adoptees. It could be for people who, were separated during the Korean War or some other time. And then there's, I think, like just the main Korean morning show, like Achimadong Korea or something, like a Morning Korea. They would sometimes have kind of reunions like that. Other people have put newspaper advertisements, classifieds in. That's not something I've done. There wasn't really enough information since it's not my birth name. And so it seemed like, well, if anyone was looking for me, they would just come back to the agency.
So your current Korean name, Sun Yung, is the name on the documents?
Mm-hmm. What it says that it was likely given to me by the social work agency. So, it's kind of impossible to know. A lot of people, their papers say they were abandoned and they weren't. A lot of people brought their children to what they thought was going to be temporary foster care. And then when they went back to get their child, the agency said, well, we sent them somewhere and we can't tell you where. They're gone, they're overseas.
Yes.
That's how they made money. So, but since there's no inconsistencies really in the paperwork that I do have, there's no real reason for me to believe that my paperwork is inaccurate, I guess.
So you didn't verify that the story on the paperwork is the true circumstance of your early years?
Yeah. I didn't try to find any of the people who were named at the time because it just seemed like it was a long time ago, and all the people who, only like 2 to 5% of Korean adoptees, I think, have found relatives through any kind of agency contact. And all of those people had more information than I did. They may have had their Korean family name or something like that. So
Do you remember which year you contacted the agency?
I think it was 2007.
Could you talk about the story on the documents, the story that you grew up with about your birth?
I think all I really ever knew was that the paperwork said I was found at a police station, that I seemed to be about 9 years old, didn't have any identifying information with me. And then I was processed by Holt in Seoul, was in foster care for about 6 months, 9 months, actually, maybe like a year, now that I think about it. No, I think it was just actually a handful of months. And that was a family, or it was like 5 adults maybe, or I can't remember, some adults and like a dog. Then I was flown with 8 other adoptees from Seoul, from Incheon Airport to Chicago. I'll have to ask my mother. I don't know if I had an escort, and I don't know if she had multiple children, but she was a Christian, like a Methodist missionary from Texas, but whose husband, they'd been doing missionary work in South Korea for many years. And so I think these missionaries, or people who, I don't know how they screened these people or how they hired these people, but if you could escort a child for adoption to the United States, like you could get a discount on your ticket back to the United States. So I have that woman's name, although I didn't pay attention. No one said who she was until I started looking through my papers again. And so I found her name. I found her family through Facebook. She was at the time still alive. I bought her husband, was a reverend, and he wrote a book. But I think because she was quite elderly, I never got a chance to actually connect with her. But yeah, so that's really the information that I grew up with.
So which year you were born and which year you arrived at the US from Seoul?
Paperwork says that I was born in 1974, and then I was apparently given the birthday of May 12th, 1974, or I was found January 9th, 1975, and then I came to the United States in June of 1975.
How your parents adopted you?
They found out about it at their church. I think that they said that their priest or someone, probably someone from the agency, was going around to churches, maybe. I'm not really sure. But so they found out at their church that they went to. Oh, there's waiting Korean children.
Did you travel to South Korea? Oh, yes. So when you first traveled to the South Korea, what did you do and what's your thoughts?
Well, I first went back in 1987. I was 13, and that was on a homeland tour for adoptees. But it was there were 6 of us, 6 adoptees, teenagers. We were all either going into high school, or one was 21 and he was just was in the U.S. Army, or just getting out of the U.S. Army. So none of us, our American families, didn't come with us. So anyway, that was my first trip back. And then I went back in 2004, 2007, 2010, 2018. And so my first impressions in 1987 were really around, I think, just a lot of the differences between the United States and South Korea at the time. It was the year before the 1988 Olympics. And so I remember there being street protests because there were all this displacing of poor people and the cleaning up of the whole Olympic Village area. The idea of South Korea is hosting the Olympics, but there's still all these people who,
yes,
can't really live. So that was really striking. South Korea was kind of the 1980s was when the United States started shifting manufacturing of, consumer goods to overseas. And so I remember thinking a lot about looking at all the knockoff, fake Nikes and fake designer bags that were in the market, and thinking about this economic, the U.S. is this wealthy country. South Korea is this country that's industrializing. So I didn't really have any answers. I was just a kid, and no one was really teaching us those things. It was more kind of cultural tour. We heard from some different kind of ministry people who said things like, "We're so sorry, but now that you're an American, you need to come back and work and make Korea stronger, like bring your education. When you finish your college education, like come back to South Korea, your homeland, So there was just really interesting messages that I think we didn't know about growing up in the United States. We didn't know, or I didn't know, that we would be met with these interesting nationalists. It's nothing weird, no one had ever talked to us about it. So yeah, those are some of my main impressions.
So at that time, you didn't know much context of Korea. When you looked back, you have a more understanding of the situation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I didn't know what it was called, but I've always, even, from a younger age, where I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, I was very interested in like class differences. I just didn't know what that was really. I mean, I just thought because my mother's family grew up very poor in the Depression, and so there was a lot of talk about like surviving the Depression and what they had to do to survive the Depression. And then I had some relatives, like adopted relatives, who went on to become fairly wealthy, but my family wasn't. So I was always just kind of trying to figure out like what all that meant. So I think going to South Korea, even though no one was really, people were talking about how like, of course, South Korea was recovering, but not until later did I have a better, start learning more frameworks for thinking about class and nation and gender, all these things. Like I remember being shocked that women couldn't drive. Like there weren't any women on the street in cars. Every driver that I saw was male. I think I remember asking. And then at our host's family, we stayed with a family of 4 who had teenage kids too, I think. And the mother, served everyone. And then she ate in the kitchen and didn't come out until after the meal was over. Like I was shocked.
Yeah, it's widespread in the East Asian areas. I think you were raised in a white family, right? Could you talk about adjustment in this family and your parents' situation?
I think I actually had a really great childhood, and I had an older brother who's adopted. He's white, a white American. So I think there was all this, language of well-adjusted. Like I did really well in school. I was involved in a lot of sports. I was doing piano and dance, these things that they weren't wealthy activities, but they were definitely things that my mom, especially, even though she didn't grow up like that, she really wanted us to have these opportunities. So we lived in the same house the whole time. My parents later got divorced when I went to college, and they really started to not get along. So aside from that kind of discord and, my adoptive father having a lot of just male personality problems from his sort of generation. He was born in 1941, I think. Both my parents, neither of them went to college. So adjustment, I grew up with there were a lot of Black students in my classes growing up, at least in grade school. I had Black teachers, I had a Black principal, and it seemed like race was not, it was okay to talk about race. It was okay to notice race. There was nothing wrong with noticing race. But here in Minnesota, my friends who've grown up here, where I am in Minnesota, really grew up really differently. Also, a lot of them were adopted by evangelical Christians or Lutherans. And then the culture up here is much more emotionally conservative and non-confrontational. And I grew up in a kind of family and culture where people would just kind of say what was on their minds. So I feel, obviously it's been a long ongoing journey just to try to understand American politics, of course, race relations, history, the real history of the United States, the history between the United States and the Koreas. So it continues to be very counterculture, to be a feminist, to be anti-racist. And that's a big part of my work. But as far as overall adjustment, I think it was really good.
I'm very glad to hear that you have a very protected childhood. And do you have any struggles in terms of understanding your identity or any uncomfortable or awkward experiences related to that?
I mean, for sure, definitely. I had to until I moved, till later in my 20s, I started meeting Korean adoptees around town who also were interested in writing, interested in art, interested in theoretical understanding understandings of Korean adoption and sort of whiteness and post-colonial studies, and like looking at it from a lens of feminism, of color. So I feel like every year I kind of like learn new things, for sure. Things that I didn't get at all in my formal education. You know, I did get to learn women's studies, anthropology, like literature, all these things, but it was never applied to what does that mean for this diaspora of displaced children who underwent this laundering, renaming process. So a lot of my friends are professors who they've made this their whole like critical adoption studies. They've made their whole careers, you know, so I've really benefited from a lot of their work, and just meeting other adoptees from around the world too, and who are, like we're all just trying to put together all the pieces of the puzzle so that whatever is true can come to light, because people are still adopting from, you know, Asia or wherever the next place where they can find adoptable children, wealthy people are going. So it's of course much bigger than just, you know, my like cohort. So I mean, I can't remember your original question, but it's like it affects everything in my life, really, like from my, you know, medical experiences to my own children and who they are and how I work with my students. I'm just very sensitive to the fact that children are in all kinds of different situations that may not be apparent from the outside. And so foster care and children who just really vulnerable, like even though I had an okay experience, adopted children are very vulnerable because they don't have no one knows where they are. No one knows who they are. They don't have extended relatives looking out for them. You know, a lot of times it was like their grandmother or someone who took them out of their birth family in Korea at the time. But even, you know, white adoptees are more vulnerable. It's become more known that there's higher suicide attempt rate for adoptees. And then I think for transracial and transnational adoptees, it's even higher for than white same race adoptees. And so the mental health piece is something that is emerging as a subfield that is it's really exciting to see, because a lot of us who are my age felt like it's been really neglected, that like sibling studies, like adoptees as parents and grandparents, of course, citizenship has become a latent emerging issue. Yeah, now then with commercial DNA, the whole, like all of this churning of the revealing of family secrets in all kinds of families. So it's really an interesting time to be thinking about family formation and ethics, like bioethics, reproductive rights. The learning, figuring things out never ends, because with each new life stage, some new thing occurs, right? So a lot of us who are my age, like we're starting to lose our adoptive parents or are taking care of adoptive parents. So some of my friends who they're going to the hospital with their adoptive parents who are these old white people, and they're constantly having to explain, I'm this person's daughter. I have authority to make decisions for them. Here's my paper. You know, like there's this added, it's nobody's fault, because like no one would look and think, well, you're obviously the daughter, like, you know, but it's just an added burden. And also the medical field is informed on how to work with families like that. So that's a new thing. It's a new life stage thing that adoptees don't have any model for in terms of grief. And so it just keeps evolving.
Do you think your parents did enough to expose you to a Korean culture when you grew up?
I mean, no, but I think that they did their best. They followed the advice at the time. They did take me to, you know, my mom made sure I went back to Korea. So that was really kind of unusual, because they didn't want to go. They'd never even been there. They didn't even have to go pick me up, right? So none of the three of my immediate family members have ever been to South Korea or experienced any interest in going there. But I think one example is that the agency told my parents, like, oh, you don't have to learn any Korean. The kids just adapt, which is true, right? But now it's really different now, after several decades of adoptee advocacy, and then plus a different relationship around what used to be just assimilation model. So I think that they did the best that they could. I don't have any complaints. I think if they'd had more formal education, they might have been more interested in like history, or might have had more resources to travel as a family. We really didn't. We were always kind of like scraping by. So yeah, I would say I'm an unusual person. I think a lot of other people had a lot more trauma, and there was like a lot more shame in their families. And so I feel like they did a good job for what they had.
Have you ever learned Korean?
I'm taking Korean lessons now, like once a week. I've taken a number of different Korean classes, language classes on and off. I hope to become, I don't even know if there's a particular goal, but I have now that my kids are grown up, I have a more flexible schedule because I'm self-employed. And because of Zoom, those three things have come together to afford me more time to do things like take Korean lessons.
Yeah, because I saw your email use your Korean name, especially the Korean alphabet, and also you have the Chinese character.
Yeah, that's what's on my Korean passport. So even though I know that it was given by Hanja, because the last name, depending on how your name is spelled in Mandarin, your name has different meanings. So because different terms have the same sound. So there's lots of different ways, depending on what your Chinese spelling is, your name could mean different things. It's just a reminder also in my just professional life that, white Americans should just not be so, insular to the rest of the world and fluent in English. I have that privilege where I'm not trying to assimilate in that way. So I can afford to have these other markers of difference, because I can advocate for myself once I get past whatever. Yeah.
When you still in school, you always use the Korean name.
No, I didn't actually. I changed my name legally after college, but I had started thinking about it when I was in college. And I thought, well, I'll change it back after I graduate.
So before that, you're using your English name.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell me the first name?
Yeah, so my American first name was Claire. And then just kind of to protect my other family members, it's not like a big secret, but I don't publicize my previous American last name. A lot of them are Republicans. And
do you want to continue trying to find any relatives, biological parents?
I don't really have any plans, but I've taken 2 DNA tests. I do have friends who found their Korean relatives through just commercial DNA. One of my close friends, her birth mother and 2 half-siblings live in Wisconsin. She grew up in Minnesota and they have been living in the States this whole time. Her mother moved to the States to try to find her back in the 70s or 80s. And so just all these amazing stories. So there's nothing that I have planned, but I would feel very lucky to find out any information, especially for my children, because their dad is an adoptee, but their dad just found their biological dad last year. So I'd love to be able to give my kids even if they couldn't meet anyone, just if they could get more information. I'd, of course, love it for myself too, but I'm at peace with it, more or less. I have a lot of friends who are in reunion, and in a lot of cases, it's very challenging. So there's also that. I wouldn't avoid it because of that, but I just know that it's definitely not a fairy tale ending, even if you do find, because there's just so much trauma.
Are you growing up with the knowledge that you were adopted?
Definitely. For as long as I can remember, obviously, because they're white people. But my brother, too, was told that he was adopted right away. It was not a secret. I definitely know a lot of people who were white, adopted into white families. It was a secret, and they figured out later.
That's so great.
Sun Yung's adoption agency Holt is a prominent agency placing many children born in South Korea with families in the US. However, Holt did not provide Sun Yung with any useful information to help her find her biological parents, raising questions about the agency's transparency and the challenges adoptees face when searching for their birth family. Sun Yung also wrote an article on Medium where she reflects on the complex emotions of being a stranger to her biological family. I highly recommend reading her piece for a deeper understanding of the adoptee feelings. You can find the article link in the episode description. Alright, as we wrap up the Korean Adoptees series, I hope that the 3 stories has provided you with valuable insights into the experiences and challenges faced by Korean adoptees. And don't forget to follow In Media Crisis on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast. Thank you for listening and see you in the next episode. Bye!